Welcome to the Streets and People podcast presented by Get Around Cabo Car Free. Get Around Cabo Car Free is a volunteer community movement advocating for more transport options for people who can't drive in Caboolture and Morayfield in Queensland. In today's podcast, we'll be covering one of these three broad topics. It might be Road Rules 360, where we discuss Queensland's road rules, the legislation, the design for people walking, biking, in wheelchairs or on a scooter. It might be Not Everyone Drives, where we chat with people whose transport options don't include a car in a car-dependent society. And it might be People and Projects, where our conversations are with people working on a specific aspect of inclusive transportation. Today we're doing one of our Not Everyone Drives episodes. I love these episodes because they are really an opportunity for people who use forms of transport that aren't a car and really give their experience of what it's like. I'm here on Gubbi Gubbi country in Caboolture. I have Antoine Burdett with me in the studio. Now, Antoine, where are you calling from?
I'm calling from Bellbird Park in Brisbane, my house. I'm working from home today.
As I'm calling from the Ipswich area, I'd specifically like to also recognise the Yagara, Yugara and Yagarapul peoples as the traditional owners of the land on which I'm calling from today. I pay my respects to the elders, past, present and emerging, for they hold the memories, traditions, culture and hopes of First Nations people across country.
Now, I came to know you because you are working with Scootmasters. I reached out to Pete Finn to ask if there was somebody he knew to come on to talk about e-scooters and the experiences. We'll be having Pete hopefully next week. Tell me, how did you end up choosing e-scooters as your vehicle? Is that your only vehicle? How did that all come into being?
Yeah, look, it's a good question. Don't necessarily work with Scootmasters. It's not really a business role per se. It's more a volunteer role. I'm one of the admins working with Pete and other people to help run the group. It's a voluntary organisation. I don't get paid for what I do with Scootmasters. I sort of volunteer my own time, and it's something I enjoy doing to basically help the community enjoy scooting in a safe way. Certainly there's no money changing hands, so to speak, so it's certainly a voluntary role. It's something I do for the love of the environment and scooting and enjoy meeting new people. It's interesting. I think back maybe 2018, 2019 was when I first was introduced to e-scooters, and that was back when it still wasn't necessarily a big thing. Hire scooters weren't rampant in Australia, that's for sure. I think I was actually in Singapore at the time doing a particular job for a particular client, and I saw these hire scooters at the time. I thought, that looks interesting and looks like a bit of fun. And I thought when I get back to Australia, I might look into that a little bit more. To cut a long story short, when I came back to Australia, I started looking into it a little bit more. And I must admit, my interest was more about pleasure, more so than as a use of transportation to get from A to B or to work. However, that was a particular positive outcome that I was looking at as well. So when I came back, I started looking online because I didn't know anything about the scooters and what was good and what was bad. And if I was looking at buying my own scooter, what should I be looking at? So I actually looked up online and did some research and came across Scootmasters. I don't think it was actually called Scootmasters back then. It was called something different, but I came across Pete and the group back when I think the group maybe had less than 1,000 members, and now we've got almost 5,000 members. So it's certainly grown quite a lot from 2018 through to 2024. Yeah, so I had some conversations with Pete and did some research and ended up going out and buying my own scooter based on recommendation from the group and based on my particular needs at the time. I ended up joining Pete and the guys for a scoot around Brisbane. Absolutely loved it, and I suppose I've never looked back since. In the years I've been involved with Scootmasters, I've sort of become more intrinsically involved. Now I'm part of the admin team, for example, and I sort of help Pete and the guys, girls, organise scoots, monitor the Facebook page, help advocate for people who enjoy the love of scooting. And that's where it sort of came about, really.
You weren't sort of transport disadvantaged. It sounds like you just had a nice experience and you thought, oh, actually, that'd be kind of cool to just play around with it, have a bit of a go. But it sounds like it's now moved into, I guess, quite a key part of your identity, freedom of movement in lots of ways. Do you own a car still?
Yeah, I still own a vehicle. I don't think a scooter is a replacement for a vehicle, but it's certainly a complementary mode of transport. As I said to you, my main interest was more around pleasure, enjoying scooting. But look at what Scootmasters are about. It's about people with the common interest getting together and socialising over e-scooters, that mechanism. In fact, in some ways, the actual scooting part is not the key thing. It's the actual meeting new people, making new friends, a social activity. It happens to be that scooters are the mechanism for that. Having said that, there are obviously a lot of people in our group who use scooters for commuting, whether that be commuting to go to a shop to get some groceries, or whether that be commuting to get to the train station or to work. And one of the members in the group works at Queensland University, and often they'll ride to Queensland University and back as opposed to use a vehicle. I tend to work from home quite a lot. When I do go into the office, which is maybe once or twice a week, typically it's via the train. Originally, I actually had intentions of actually using a scooter to get to the train station and back as a mode of transport. But because where I live is quite hot quite a lot of the months of the year, and the idea of actually getting on a scooter and getting to the train station, getting hot and sweaty before going to work wasn't necessarily attractive. I ended up actually not doing that. So for the 1 or 2 days a week, I just drive down to the train station and then catch a train. And so I'm using trains as a public transport mechanism predominantly. So for me personally, I tend not to use a scooter as a means of transport for getting from A to B or for work or for getting groceries. For me, it's really about the entertainment, the pleasure, the enjoyment of actually doing that with a group of people, seeing different places in Brisbane or Sunshine Coast or Gold Coast where we tend to ride, different places that you would not normally see, and doing that with a bunch of people that are like-minded. So to me, that's what I'm getting out of riding a scooter, but I do appreciate that there are people who aren't just using it for pleasure, they're using it for transport, whether that be for work or for other things.
How far for you from home to the station?
It's probably about 6-7 kilometres, I suppose. It's not really that far in distance. When I drive to the station, it's probably about a 5-minute drive. If I was to take the scooter, it would probably be maybe 10-15 minutes, so a little bit longer. But 15 minutes in the heat out where I live is quite considerable.
And how long does it take you to park the car?
Not very long. I park across the road in a shopping centre, and it's probably at the time of day I would go into the office, only really a few minutes. And then a walk to the train station's probably maybe 100 metres or 200 metres.
Okay, because often people don't calculate how long it takes them to find a park when they say, oh, it just takes me 5 minutes, and then it's actually 20 minutes to find a car park. There are transport planners and infrastructure designers who will be listening to this. You spoke a lot about the heat. Would you like the footpaths or the streets or bike path covered so that it was cooler? We are going to be getting hotter and hotter climates. So if we made the streets cooler for you to travel, would you still go by car, do you think?
I would suspect that would be quite a way off or quite unlikely because the cost for the infrastructure would be significant. Whilst I'd appreciate being able to ride with some sort of protection, that would probably make it more palatable for me to probably travel to the train station, or I'll probably look at doing that. There are other factors such as security of the scooter. Yes, the train station has an ability to lock up your scooter, etc., but there's still a security issue around there. And currently, one of the biggest issues we're facing is people stealing scooters. It's a big thing at the moment. And even though you may lock your scooter up, they're still going there with certain tools, etc. If they want the scooter, they'll take it despite how much effort you go about trying to secure your particular scooter. So that's still an issue. It's getting worse. So I think there's a number of different factors. Certainly heat for me personally is an issue. It may not necessarily be for others, but your ideas sound great, but I sort of can't see that happening. The idea of having that protection. And unfortunately, you can't sort of go along on a scooter with an umbrella.
Basically, there's no form of transport infrastructure that doesn't cost more to implement than it does to use. A bicycle, for instance, is free to ride on, but of course you have to build a bike path. A car is however much it is, but you also still have to build all the streets and roads, which are heinously expensive.
Right. And, there are people who ride to work, and there's people, like I said, who use a scooter, and they're quite comfortable doing that. If that means they're going to spend a few more minutes at work to have a shower once they get there or at the station, whatever the case may be, they do that. Just because I personally don't doesn't mean that a lot of others don't, that they certainly would ride irrespective of the temperature. I just find that where I live, it's hot 10 months out of the 12. So for me personally, I tend not to do that. If the infrastructure was there, I'd certainly consider it.
There is a lot of conversation about how are we going to reduce the urban heat effect, where all our streets are so hot because they're black and we haven't got trees and things.
And of course, on a scooter, you're quite close to the ground, right? On a bicycle, because the centre is slightly different, the centre of gravity when you're riding is slightly higher up. On a scooter, you're standing and your feet are actually a lot closer to the ground. The wheels are smaller, so the way you stand, the way you ride, the proximity to the ground and other infrastructure is slightly different to a bicycle or even a motorbike.
When you said it's very hot, I immediately assumed it was about the sun bearing down on your head. But what you're describing there is actually more the heat in your legs and your feet.
Well, it's both, right? It's the sun directly from above, but it's also the reflection of heat coming from the ground because you tend to be closer to the ground than when you're on a bicycle.
How do you find the infrastructure works for you? One of the things that I discovered when starting Get Around, Cabo Car Free, was the quality of the footpaths. I had never really noticed all the ridges and the camber, the number of people who parked cars in driveways across the footpath, people parking on footpaths and those sorts of things. things, which I know for people with disabilities is a really huge issue. Scooters are quite a bit narrower, but the wheels are very small. How much is footpath design an impact on scooters? That's the only place you're supposed to use them.
It's a good question. Legally, depending upon the location, yes, in some cases we need to be on the footpaths. There are cases where the road rules, we are allowed on the road or shared paths or bicycle paths depending upon the situation. So for example, roads that are 50 kilometres an hour or less, depending upon the type of road, we can actually use the road pavement itself. There are areas where we have to use a footpath, and you're correct. The scooter wheels typically being quite small, as I said before, the centre of gravity when you're riding makes it a bit of a risk to safety on some of our footpaths. And I think that that's one of the areas where it needs to be looked at. A lot of the footpaths we ride on, some are good, where there has been investment in infrastructure, but there are a lot of footpaths where there's deviations, there's holes, there's cracks corroding. On the middle of the footpath, you might find a manhole, for example, or some sort of entry point to public infrastructure, and sometimes they're not always flat. And as you said, the scooter wheels are quite small. And what happens is, if you're not careful, you can actually hit those sorts of objects or hit like a different grade in the footpath. Before you know it, you're flying forward on the handlebars and you're having an accident. Whilst I'm supportive of, the whole safety rules around where we can ride and where we can't ride, and I'm more than happy to ride on the footpath, but in some cases, it's actually more dangerous and more risky to do that than actually to ride, say, on a road or a bikeway that may be on a road that's maybe greater than 50 kilometres an hour where the rules prohibit you. So to me, it's a bit about a risk assessment in terms of what's safe for us and the community around us, the pedestrians that we ride around and the other cyclists, for example. But yeah, I certainly see that there is some investment required in our footpaths especially. But I would also like to see, from a transport planning point of view, look at the rules over time and see whether there's an opportunity to get us on the road where maybe we can't legally do that at the moment, based on risk assessment and based on infrastructure, of course.
We have a series on Queensland road rules. We did an episode on where could scooters be ridden, and you can't ride where there is a dotted line in the middle of the road, even if it's 50 kilometres an hour, even if it's 30 kilometres an hour.
Unless there's a bike lane. If it's 50 kilometres an hour and it's a centre line, you can't. But if there's a clear bike lane and it's 50, you can.
And many are technically not bike lanes. They have the green stripe and they might have a bicycle symbol on it. But unless you have the sign at the beginning and a sign at the end that says this is a bike lane, it's actually not a bike lane. So this is what I've discovered. It's so unclear, and it's difficult for police to enforce, and it's difficult for people to know where to ride. If you're on a bicycle, it's like this. If it's a scooter, like that. Say our listener is a transport planner. Many people like e-scooters because they're much cheaper than owning a car, and it's much easier for them to travel, to store the vehicle if they've maybe converted their garage into something else. What are some suggestions that you have for transport planners? What would make it better? So I'm not talking about the road rules legislators. That's a separate question. But in terms of street design, anything else that you think would be helpful for transport planners?
One of the key things is that we've got a lot of good infrastructure out there that people can actually go along, form bike paths that are away from other infrastructure, cars, vehicles, etc., away from main roads. One of the things that is quite a challenge is how they connect with each other. So we have lots of pockets of good infrastructure, but often, especially when we do our rides, for example, we're doing quite a long ride, maybe 40, 50 kilometres around Brisbane. We have to connect between these different good areas of infrastructure. And sometimes by doing that, those connections aren't necessarily as good as they could be in terms of you need to go onto, say, roads or footpaths, whatever the case may be. Looking at the connectivity of the infrastructure across southeast Queensland would be a good thing to do to try and minimise the need to interact with main roads, for example, or footpaths where some of the footpaths are quite narrow, as you said before. They could have damage or cracks, etc. But one of the key things as well is some of the footpaths that we go on, they're quite narrow, but they're also quite close to, say, shops and houses and driveways. Constantly cars coming in and out, people coming out of properties or out of houses. And because of the narrow footpath, it's actually quite risky and dangerous for both the scooter rider but also members of the public. Whereas if we maybe were allowed on the road next to it, I know this comes back to the laws and legislation, it may be less risky and imply greater safety by doing that, even though the current legislation based on the road type may prohibit that. So I think that it's a combination of things. It's about the infrastructure, investing in that further, looking at connectivity across the bike paths and the shared pathways across southeast Queensland, but also looking at the laws and legislation.
There's a couple of things about house frontages these days. You've got the 8-foot fence, which is really high. So it doesn't see anybody moving on the footpath that perhaps 20 years ago, 30 years ago, you would actually see people before they came up. They also had smaller cars. They tended not to have their windows rolled completely up, so they might hear people more effectively. Whereas today, you've got those 8-foot fences, shut-in cars, quite big cars, people coming along on scooters or bicycles, for instance, in my case. And it can be quite sudden for both parties. Have you ever been hit by a car?
Not personally, no. I do know of other people who have had interactions with vehicles, but to be honest with you, not as many as you would think. I could probably count underneath one hand how many times I've heard of somebody doing that. Most of the time when there's accidents, it's people having accidents because of issues associated with damage to the ground, or there's a root sticking out and they've hit it and they've fallen off their scooter. So it's mainly to do with that. One of the other things we see quite a lot of, especially when it comes to riding on footpaths, is foliage. Trees is a big issue for us. A lot of the times we're seeing that there's trees quite low to the ground and not necessarily being maintained or cut back. And as you can imagine, on a scooter, you're standing up mostly. We do have people who sit down on their scooters. It's probably easier for them, but people who stand up on their scooters, often you're ducking underneath trees and branches. And that process of ducking down on a footpath actually dangerous in its own right, because by doing that, you're sort of putting yourself off a standard center of balance. Again, it's about that risk assessment. Sometimes we're finding that it's actually quite unsafe to be riding on certain footpaths, yet the current legislation says that's where we must be if that's a particular piece of road where we're not allowed to, say, go on the side of the road, for example. I think the councils obviously need to consider in those areas where e-scooting or bicycle riding has to be on the footpath for maximising safety, maybe they need to have a look at foliage management and vegetation management in those areas.
Everybody wants trees, or we want trees over there, but not right in front of my place.
Well, the trees are fine. It's just the matter of if they're quite low and the branches are going over the encasement around the footpath, even people walking, they have to duck, right? So it's just not removing the trees. They're fine to be there. It's just maybe cutting down the foliage a little bit or some of the low-hanging branches just to make sure there's a particular clearance allowed for pedestrians, scooter riders, bicycle riders, for example, or even parents with trolleys and prams and all of those sorts of things.
You can use the app SnapSenSolve to report overgrown foliage. E-scooters can be seen as quite antagonistic. People have found them to be quite objectionable. Have you experienced that sort of sentiment from people?
I would say yes, we have, but what we're finding now is that the level of those types of perspectives from the community is actually less than it was a while ago. There's always going to be that, right? Because what we're finding is people out there doing the wrong thing, especially hire scooters. We always comment on that when we go on our rides. We're seeing people always doing the wrong thing on hire scooters. Not just the wrong thing in terms of safety, be wearing helmets, they'll be doubling, speeding, maybe not so much speeding on a hire scooter because they're restricted, but still speeding in the sense that it might be a 12-kilometre area and they're still doing 25 kilometres an hour. Especially myself, when I'm in the office and say a Monday, I'll walk from the office to the train station and I'll be passing hire scooters who are obviously speeding on the actual footpath, not wearing a helmet. And what we're finding is they have complete disregard for the public around them, and that causes a certain sense of public dislike. But groups like Scootmasters, what we try and do, or we try and set a good example. So when we're out doing our group rides, we certainly want to make sure that we show certain respect for the public, other cyclists, families, children, pets, etc. around us. So we have a particular approach for how we interact with others. If we stop, for example, to regroup, sometimes we have quite a lot of people on our rides, maybe between 20 and 30, and often we're regrouping, for example. So we'll stop in the pathway, but we'll always get across on the left, make sure we're in single file so people can pass. We're always acknowledging people. So if we do pass somebody on a footpath, we'll slow down, we'll ting the bell, and we'll acknowledge them as we go past. We'll say, hey, thanks very much, guys. If we have, say, 20 scooters, we'll say, just bear in mind there's about 20 scooters behind us. So we typically interact with the public in a way that's showing courtesy and not trying to blow them over like some hire scooters. Even some bicycle riders do that, right? So typically it's about showing courtesy. And in my experience, a lot of people are actually really good now. They'll wave to us, or the kids will wave to us. We'll talk to the kids. We'll have a conversation with some people who are very interested about scooting generally and about using that mode of transport. There's always going to be somebody who's going to take offense because of the experience with others. And unfortunately, it's the minority, as with anything that ruins it. But generally speaking, we find because of the way we interact with the community and people around, we get very positive feedback. And it's very rare these days we get somebody who's aggressive to us.
We don't have scooter hire High here in Moreton Bay. My observation is that it's usually young guys who are often the hooners. They've got these very, very fast e-scooters that they own themselves. They're going really quickly, maybe with or without a helmet, maybe with or without shoes, definitely over 50, 60, 70 kilometers an hour, and often on the busy streets. It is that young guy thing, I think. And it doesn't matter whether they're in cars, they're on bikes, they're on e-scooters. This is my observation, that it's just something about that energy of being a young guy.
I'd certainly say that you're right, but I wouldn't necessarily just stereotype and say that's the only cohort that I would see doing the wrong thing. I often see there'll be like young girls on scooters doubling, for example, or not wearing helmets, and also speeding. But I do agree that statistically, it's probably more young males that potentially are, especially speeding and doing those sorts of things. But I wouldn't necessarily pigeonhole and say that's the only cohort of people that are doing the wrong thing.
I wasn't meaning to do that. It was more a reputation for e-scooters are bad and e-scooters are hooning, and there is that. What I see is just young guys being young guys, and the tool of the day is the e-scooter, which they've souped up.
I suppose it's a focus point at the moment because e-scooters are quite prominent in terms of out there in the media, especially the accidents and fires that have been happening in the last number of months, couple of years. It's no different to young guys hooning in cars. It's just the fact there's also young guys hooning in scooters. It really doesn't matter what the mode of transport is. There'll always be somebody doing the wrong thing, whether it's a motor vehicle, whether it's a motorbike, or whether it's an e-scooter or a push bike even, or an e-bike.
What else would you like to share about your experience of being on an e-scooter? Perhaps the changes that you've noticed in the past 6 years since you started, well, in Singapore and then here.
It was interesting. Singapore, I think, have actually removed their scooters now, so they don't allow hire scooters and they don't allow scooters in the CBD because of concerns around security. But then again, Singapore is quite a small place, quite dense in population, so they have specific issues and requirements. I suppose what I've seen is a couple of things. I've seen obviously an increase in infrastructure, especially like when there's new estates being developed. There's more thought in the process around transport planning, around actually building proper bikeways, dedicated bikeways that have proper infrastructure. So we can sort of see that coming through, which is really good. And obviously the other big thing is the amount of people in e-scooters now. And when I say the amount of people, there's a lot more growth in e-scooters, both personal e-scooters, devices that people have bought themselves, their own personal ones, but also with the hire scooters. But as I said, the increase in use of hire scooters, to me, from what I see personally and as a group, we often see that the majority of those people are not doing the right thing, and that actually causes issues for us who are trying to do the right thing. I think that in the future, I'd like to hope that maybe there's better, I'm not sure, education, control over how people use scooters, both private and hire scooters, whether that be education programs or mandatory training around basic skills, for example, because riding a scooter does require a certain set of basic skills to make sure you're riding safely, both for you but also for the public. I certainly think that there could be some programs that are out there, whether that be supported by the likes of somebody like Scootmasters or other groups that can actually facilitate those education programs in terms of how to ride safely, both from a technical skills point of view, but also about riding in the right places, following the law, proper use of PPE, for example, with helmets and knee pads, and correct riding stance and braking, those sorts of things to make your experience much more enjoyable, but also make the experience of people around you more enjoyable in terms of not being seen as the aggravator, but seeing somebody who's actually working with the community and actually riding in a way that's not going to cause anger, for example. I think there's some of the key things, and just keep working on the infrastructure to improve it, and look at the current rules and legislation and look at ways of sort of extending that, improving that to make it safe for both the scooter rider, the bicycle rider, and the public.
I do know someone who's preparing and planning a scoot school on the Sunshine Coast.
There's certainly been some discussion about that, but I'm not going to the point where I would say that we want to introduce mandatory licensing, for example, and skills competency. That would be quite difficult to manage. That would come at a cost. But I certainly think that there's some sort of middle ground around education and basic skills training, especially when it comes to people on hire scooters. People have their own scooters. I'm not saying they're that much better, but they tend to be because of the nature of the investment in that, as opposed to somebody who's never ridden a scooter and put their credit card onto a hire scooter and goes through a ride for the first time and not having the actual basic skills to be able to ensure a certain level of safety. There may be some opportunities in terms of how we can look at providing a basic level of training that's somehow mandated, but not necessarily to the point where it's going to cost too much to administer.
I know that a lot of tourists to Brisbane use hire scooters. So interesting with the Olympic Games coming up. that's something to really bear in mind, is how are tourists going to use e-scooters reliably for the short period that they're here?
And I do think some basic level of skills training before you're allowed to go on a scooter may be worthwhile. It's not just about the technical skills, it's about riding safely and about use of helmets and so forth. I see so many people out there not wearing helmets, and particularly on hire scooters, and we've seen results of what accidents could look like when people don't wear a helmet. If we could go out there and show what actually happens when you come off a scooter, I think the current legislation says the minimum requirements of bicycle helmet. And from a Scootmasters point of view, we quite actively promote the use of a full face helmet. So we actually go above and beyond the minimum standard to try and increase safety for ourselves, because, as I said before, the center of balance is different on a scooter. If you do come off and have an accident, it's quite easy to go forward over the handlebars and what we call face plant, and a bicycle helmet will protect your face. So we have a full face helmet, so if people do fall off, they got that protection. Because we have seen incidents where people have done that and they've caused damage to their face and had to spend lots of money in dental treatment, for example. It's not a nice thing. So we certainly tend to go above and beyond that minimum standard around what we should be wearing to support and protect ourselves, from knee pads to elbow pads, for example, full face helmet, shin pads, and so forth. Fully closed in shoes, all those sorts of things. We tend to promote and educate through our rides and the members who join us a better form and more safer form of using e-scooters. And we hope that people who come on our rides obviously will then take those skills and techniques they've learned and understanding of what's actually safe riding and take that back to the way they use a scooter for their own purposes, whether that be for transport to work or the shops.
Full face helmets definitely are a good thing. I have a bicycle, but I have a full face helmet because I figure, well, if I'm going along at, I don't know, 40, 50 kilometers an hour, even if I come off at 25 kilometers an hour and I just fall off, you can just hit the curb.
It doesn't have to be a big speed, right? I've seen people come off at 10 kilometers an hour or less without a full face helmet and cause problems. Obviously, the higher the speed, the more impact, but generally speaking, what we're seeing is accidents can occur quite often at quite low speeds. And the results, if you're not wearing adequate protection, is quite significant. And when I say a full face helmet, I'm not talking about a full motorcycle helmet. Most of us on our group rides will wear a lightweight full face helmet, the likes that you wear for, say, motocross or mountain bike riding. Most of these helmets are quite open, they allow airflow through, quite lightweight. So you can actually get a reasonably good helmet that's not necessarily a burden to you to wear like a full face motorcycle helmet.
So that's pretty much it. Before we close out, is there anything else that you would like to share with transport planners or anybody who is considering getting an e-scooter? We will be having Pete Finn on from Scootmasters soon, but if there's anything else you would like to share.
E-scooters are not going to go away. They're very popular from the point of view of personal hobby, entertainment, enjoyment, as well as an actual means of transport to get you from A to B, whether it be for work or for other domestic activities. I think it's just continually review and look at how transport planners can better provide for that particular need in the community. It's not going away. One of the challenges is the investment in the dollars. It does cost money, but obviously there's a need to look at where they should prioritize that based on geography and location. As I mentioned earlier, there are some areas where there's really bad footpaths. Those areas maybe where there's quite a high frequency of scooter riders, especially around the Brisbane city, and those areas should be prioritized to look at improving those conditions by fixing up the footpaths or cutting down some of the vegetation. So I think it's a matter of looking at maybe where the priority areas are being frequented mostly by scooter riders, do a condition assessment of the infrastructure and maybe try and invest money where they're going to get greater bang for the buck in terms of the maximum number of scooter riders going to get value out of those particular investments.
So I think that's it from me, unless there's any final words that you would like to mention.
I think one of the most significant things, obviously, is the legislation and the rules. There's obviously continued review and work happening in that space. So we're looking forward to seeing where that goes in the future. And as I said before, enabling a better infrastructure and safe places for us to scoot. And the current rules and legislation, whilst it's there for a purpose, safety is key, there are aspects of that which don't necessarily work in our favour. And I think we're working with the likes of the decision makers to sort of help evolve the rules, etc., to the point where I think it's going to be quite good in the future for us here in Queensland. There are other states that are obviously a bit behind us, and we're actually quite lucky here in terms of where we can ride our scooters, and it's fantastic. Scootmasters is just one of the organisations out there that are like-minded people come together for scoot rides. There are others out there, so it is quite popular, especially in South East Queensland. We really enjoy what we do, and we hope we can continue to do it.
Well, we also would like an overhaul of the road rules for bike riders, pedestrians, mobility scooters. The whole thing is unnecessarily complicated and difficult to comply with. So I think that's it. Thank you very much for coming on the show, and I really appreciated you taking the time out, particularly at such short notice.
Sure, look, I appreciate the opportunity, and if anybody is interested in coming and seeing what it's actually like, never having been on a a group ride before, come and check us out, Scootmasters, and have a look at past ride videos just to see what it's about. And come and join us for a ride sometime. We'd like to have you.
Thanks so much, Antoine.
All right, thank you.
Thanks for enjoying Streets and People, presented by Get Around Cabo Car Free. We publish our podcast regularly at the usual places and on our website, where you can find out more about us. getaroundcabocarfree.com.au. That's www.getaround, get around, that's pretty straightforward. Cabo, C-A-B-O, that's short for Caboolture. Car Free, C-A-R-F-R-E-E. There's no hyphen in that. .com.au. Our theme music is The Thief on AM Sound, which is just like our cars on our streets, always stealing the space. So let's stop that thief.